The experiment is often treated as the gold standard in psychological research because it is a style of investigation that allows us to determine whether one variable causes changes in another variable. I was talking about this at the end of our correlation video. I want to know, as a researcher, if this is what I'm studying, whether watching more Netflix makes your grades go down. I want to be able to say not just that those two things are related, but that one of those things causes the other thing. Well, if I do my job right and I run a tightly designed and successful experiment, I can make those causal inferences because I am going to be manipulating the variable of interest, my independent variable, and observing what change then comes about in my outcome variable. In the scenario that I've described, the number of Netflix hours watched per week would be my independent variable. That is the thing that I am going to be varying, the thing I'm going to be manipulating, and I need to keep tight control over that if I want to have any say or have any confidence that there is a causal relationship between these variables. And then my dependent variable, my outcome, is the thing that I actually care about, GPA in this instance, right? And I'm only measuring GPA, but I'm manipulating Netflix hours watched per week because that's my independent variable. Independent variable is the one that you manipulate in an experiment, okay? So, because I have control of the scenario, because I have control over that independent variable, any differences that I find in people's GPA should be, at least theoretically, due to my manipulation, right? So what I'm going to do then, if I'm setting up this experiment, is I am going to bring in my participants and I am going to assign them to different levels of Netflix watching. I'm going to say, you 5 people or you 10 people, you are watching zero Netflix at all, no TV, right? Let's make it broader, just say TV in general, not just Netflix. And then this group, you are watching 10 hours per week. And then this other group, you're going to watch 20 hours per week. Now, I do have to be careful there because there may be other, in fact, you can probably think of some, other variables that are going to impact people's GPA that is not how many hours per week they are watching TV. You can probably think of a few, right? What your IQ level is, how many hours you spend studying, etc., etc. So as a good researcher, I am going to need to control for those confounds, meaning that minimally, I'm going to need to know what that data is so that I can try to statistically control for it, right? Ideally, I set up an experiment where I'm controlling not just the amount of TV that people are watching per week, but also how many hours that they're studying. Now, I'm unlikely to be able to control people's levels of IQ because that's more or less baked in at this point. But I'm going to need to at least know what it is so that I can plug that into my equations statistically so that I can see whether or not that is having an impact, right? If I account for that impact, then I can still say that my TV watching has some effect, right? So long as I know what IQ is doing and what number of hours studying per week is actually doing, right? So that I mentioned in terms of controlling for variables. That is another way you can guard against confounds. The more basic ways to guard against confounds are using these factors, where you are going to separate people either into a control group or an experimental group. So you want to not just manipulate how much people are watching TV, but also then have people that have no level of the independent variable at all. So my control group in this scenario would be people watching 0 hours of TV per week, right? I also then want to randomly assign people to either my control group or my experimental group. This helps because, like we said, people are going to vary on other factors that we may or may not be measuring. So, like level of IQ, for instance, you're probably going to have a higher GPA if you have a higher IQ. But if I randomly assign people to either my no TV watching or lots of TV watching groups, then the high IQ person has an equal chance of ending up in either group, meaning that if I have a large enough sample, those individual differences should statistically wash out. They should even themselves out with a large enough group. So long as I've got 30 people in each group, having the fact that I've got a couple of smarties and a couple of dummies in both groups, I'm likely to have a roughly equal number in both, and so that helps wash out those differences. And if those differences wash out, then the only differences left over that matter are the ones that I'm introducing, right? So that's the benefit of a random assignment. Now, a masked design is when you are you don't allow the individual to know which group they're in, right? So this would be very difficult to do in the scenario that I've set up because you know whether or not you're watching television. But under different circumstances, that becomes very important. For instance, if I am if I've developed a smarts pill that is supposed to increase people's GPA, I am going to, first of all, set up a control group, right? And I'm going to give that control group a placebo pill and say, hey, this is supposed to make you smarter. And then to my other group, my experimental group, I'm going to give the real pill and say, hey, this is supposed to make you smarter, right? But I am not going to let any individual know whether they are getting the real pill or the fake one. And if I really want to be careful, I'm not even going to let the person handing out the pills know which is which. That's what we call a double-blind study, where not the individual themselves doesn't know what group they're in, and also the administrator of the experiment doesn't know which group they're in. This does a couple of different things. The participant being blind to their condition, or what condition they're in, keeps them from trying to give you what they think you want, which participants do, right? People come into your study, they want your study to be successful, so if they think that you want them to work really hard on whatever test you're giving them, they will do so, right? If they think that they're in the group that is supposed to be bad at the test, they'll flub it. And they're not trying to mess things up, they're just trying to give you what you want. We, as humans, try to give each other what we want most of the time. So that's a problem. So you don't want to let them know what group they're in. Now, in terms of blinding the administrator, well, that's a different issue, but ends up being a problem as well. If the administrator knows what group the person belongs to, they may treat them differently once again, in order to help you find what you're trying to find, right? So I may treat the person who is in my control group for the smarts pill differently, and treat them like maybe a little bit more of a dummy, or like they're not going to do as well on the test. Not meaning to, but simply because I know what group they're in, I may treat them differently, and that can skew the results. So this is the advantage of the double-blind study, not just the single-blind. Okay, I think that's most of what I wanted to talk about. So with the control group, yeah, you want them to have the same experience minus the exposure to the independent variable. So this is why we give people a placebo pill. We want them to be doing exactly the same thing as the experimental group, except not be exposed to whatever condition or drug that we're giving to the experimental group. Now, with experiments, we use that same rubric or set of rules of thumb as we were talking about in correlational studies in terms of statistical significance. We want to find differences that are highly unlikely to have occurred by chance. And on top of that, especially as it relates to abnormal psychology, we want to know not only if something is statistically significant, but also whether it's clinically significant. You can end up finding, again, going back to my smarts pill idea, right? I give people a smarts pill, they get higher GPAs. I want to know not only whether I am creating a statistically significant difference between my groups, but also whether that difference is big enough to matter in real life. If I'm increasing GPA by 0.05, Who cares, right? I mean, that's the difference between a 3.695 and a 3.7. I'm good either way, thanks, right? Because it's just not a big enough difference to matter. We want to be creating differences that actually are going to create changes, especially when we're talking about treating folks who are suffering from mental illnesses. We want to create differences that matter for them, that have clinical significance, not just statistical significance. Okay, random assignment and blinding I have already talked about. So I think I'm going to go ahead and cut us off there. Do make sure to look over in this chapter because once again, I am not covering everything in these slides like I would if we were actually in class, because otherwise you'd be watching 2 to 3 hour videos, and I don't think you want to do that. But I encourage you to take a look at some of the alternative research designs that are there in the chapter, as well as the information about the Institutional Review Board. That's going to be important stuff. All right. Thanks, everybody. That's going to be it for this week. We will come back to you next week with those chapters. I think number 4 and 5, if I remember right. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend. We'll see you soon.